Claire Montgomery learned how to disappear without leaving a room. On a gray Manhattan morning, she stood by the window of a borrowed apartment, watching the city move like it always had, fast, indifferent, unstoppable. Yellow taxis cut through rain-slicked streets. Office lights blinked on across the skyline. Somewhere below, a barista shouted an order, and a delivery truck double-parked without apology. Life didn't pause just because hers had collapsed. 3 hours earlier, she had signed the divorce papers. Not with shaking hands, not with tears. She signed them calmly, the way someone does when they already know the argument is over. Across the polished conference table, Julian Cross leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, watching her as if she were a problem finally solved. "You'll be fine," he said, smiling thinly. "You always land on your feet. Or you'll learn." The lawyer slid the documents away. The sound of paper against glass echoed louder than it should have. Julian stood, buttoned his jacket, and added the final cut, delivered with practiced indifference. "Let's be honest, Claire. You never had leverage. You married up. This is just the reset." Claire said nothing. She picked up her coat. She didn't remind him of the years she rearranged her life around his ambition. She didn't list the dinners eaten alone, the friends quietly erased, the small humiliations she learned to swallow because marriage was supposed to mean endurance. She walked out without asking for anything. Now, alone, she rested her palm against the cold window. She had no home in her name, no joint accounts, no explanation ready for the silence that would follow once the adrenaline wore off. Julian had been thorough, efficient. He called it clean. What he didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that Claire had been living without leverage on purpose. Her phone buzzed once on the table behind her. An unknown number. No message, just a missed call. She ignored it. Claire had spent most of her life learning how to survive with less. Less noise, less attention, less expectation. When her mother died, people praised her for being strong. When her father vanished from her life, they said she was independent. When Julian slowly took control of every shared decision, friends called it practical. Strength, independence, practicality, words people use when they don't see the cost. She moved back into the room and sat on the edge of the bed, folding her hands together. The silence pressed in. This was supposed to be the part where she broke down, where regret arrived late and useless, where she wondered if she should have fought harder, begged softer, stayed quieter. Instead, something else settled in her chest. Clarity. The phone buzzed again. This time a text appeared. "Ms. Montgomery. This is Thomas Hale, legal counsel. We need to speak today. It's urgent." Claire stared at the screen, her breath slow, controlled. Julian thought he had erased her. He had no idea he'd just signed away the only thing he could never earn back. And this was only the beginning. Before the divorce, before the papers, and the quiet humiliation, Claire Montgomery had already been living inside a cage no one else could see. It wasn't built with locks or raised voices. Julian Cross was far too polished for that. His control arrived, wrapped in reason, delivered through spreadsheets, calendar invites, and casual remarks that sounded almost kind. At first, it felt like structure. Then it became permission. Julian handled the finances because he was better with numbers. He paid the rent on their Manhattan apartment, managed investments, tracked expenses on a shared app she wasn't allowed to edit. When Claire wanted to buy something, new shoes, a coat, even a plane ticket to visit an old friend, she mentioned it first. Not because he demanded it, but because silence followed if she didn't. "Just checking," he would say, scrolling through his phone. "We're trying to be smart." Smart meant Claire stopped replacing things. She stretched old sweaters. She declined lunches. She told herself it was temporary, that once Julian made partner, things would loosen. That marriage was teamwork, and someone had to be the practical one. What she didn't notice at first was how small her world became. Julian discouraged her freelance work, not outright, just gently. "It's inconsistent," he said. "Why stress yourself out for pocket change? When she talked about applying for a full-time role, he smiled like a patient adult. Why compete when you don't need to? He kissed her forehead, sealing the argument. Her friends faded next. Dinner invitations conflicted with Julian's schedule. Phone calls felt intrusive. They don't really get our life, he'd say, pouring wine, steering the conversation elsewhere. Claire believed him. She wanted to. Even her opinions began to feel optional. At corporate events, Julian introduced her without context. This is Claire. No last name, no mention of her work, her intelligence, the way she once held rooms with quiet authority. When she spoke, he interrupted smoothly, correcting details that didn't matter, signaling when it was time to smile and move on. She learned to read those signals well. By the time Claire realized what was happening, the pattern was complete. She had access to everything but ownership of nothing. Her life ran on Julian's approval, and the most dangerous part was how reasonable it all looked from the outside. No bruises, no shouting, no dramatic fights, just a slow erasure. So when Julian told her, weeks later, that the marriage wasn't efficient anymore, it didn't come as a shock. It came as confirmation. Claire didn't lose her marriage in the conference room. She had lost it piece by piece, long before she ever signed her name. The night Julian decided to stop pretending, the city dressed up for him. It was a winter fundraiser at a glass-walled venue overlooking Midtown, all white light and champagne flutes. Claire wore a simple black dress she'd owned for years, tailored carefully so it wouldn't invite comment. Julian arrived late, confident, already half smiling at people who mattered more than she did. From the moment they stepped inside, Claire felt the shift. Julian walked ahead, not beside her. Introductions were rushed, names forgotten. When she paused to greet someone, he kept moving, forcing her to choose between politeness and obedience. She chose to follow. At their table, a junior partner asked what Claire did. She opened her mouth, then felt Julian's hand touch her knee, a warning disguised as affection. "She's taking time off," Julian said smoothly. "We decided it made more sense." The partner nodded, uninterested. Claire swallowed the explanation she hadn't been allowed to give. Later, during drinks, a woman Claire recognized from previous events laughed too loudly at something Julian said. Madeline Price. Young, sharp, immaculate. She didn't look at Claire once. She spoke to Julian as if Claire were furniture. When Claire finally joined the circle, Madeline smiled thinly. "Oh, I didn't realize you were still here." Julian laughed. Not awkwardly, not apologetically. He laughed like the line had landed exactly where it was meant to be. People watched. Some pretended not to. Claire felt heat crawl up her neck, but she stayed still. Years of practice had taught her how. Later, as speeches began, Julian stood to mingle instead of sitting beside her. From across the room, Claire saw him lean close to Madeline, his posture relaxed in a way it hadn't been with her for months. When Madeline touched his arm, he didn't pull away. Someone at Claire's table leaned in and whispered, "You must be so proud. Julian's doing incredibly well." Claire smiled. "Yes," she said, "he is." When the applause swelled and the lights dimmed, Claire excused herself and went to the restroom. She locked the door, rested her hands on the sink, and stared at her reflection. This was the moment she understood something irreversible. Julian wasn't embarrassed by her. He was finished with her, and the world was already being taught to agree. Claire didn't confront Julian the night she knew for sure. She waited 3 days, not out of fear, but because something inside her wanted to be absolutely certain before it broke. Certainty, she had learned, was the difference between pain and paralysis. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, ordinary enough to feel unreal. Claire had left the apartment to clear her head, walking aimlessly through the neighborhood near his office. She told herself she wasn't looking for anything, that this was just movement, not instinct. Then she saw Julian's car parked on a side street it had no reason to be on. The restaurant wasn't extravagant. That was what made it worse. A quiet place with linen napkins and low lighting, designed for conversations meant to stay private. Through the window, Claire saw Julian first, seated comfortably, jacket off, sleeves rolled. He looked relaxed in a way she hadn't seen at home in months. Then Madeline leaned forward. She wasn't dressed to impress. No performance, no seduction. Just ease, familiarity, the kind that comes from knowing you don't have to try. Julian smiled at her. Not the public smile he used at events, not the impatient one reserved for Claire's questions. This smile was soft, unguarded, almost grateful. Claire stood frozen on the sidewalk as Madeline reached across the table and placed her hand over Julian's. He didn't flinch. He didn't glance around. He turned his hand slightly, intertwining their fingers as if it were the most natural thing in the world. There was no drama, no passion, no urgency, and that was the cruelest part. This wasn't an affair driven by desire or impulse. It was an escape. Madeline listened while Julian spoke, nodding, asking questions. She didn't challenge him. She didn't need reassurance. She offered him something Claire hadn't realized he was craving so desperately. Validation without history. Claire felt the air leave her lungs, not because she was heartbroken, but because the truth finally settled into place. Julian wasn't cheating because he was unhappy. He was cheating because he no longer wanted to carry the weight of being seen. With Claire, there were expectations, memories, a shared past that demanded accountability. With Madeline, there was only admiration. Claire turned away before they noticed her. She walked until her legs burned, until the city blurred into noise. When she finally stopped, she understood something with absolute clarity. Julian didn't love Madeline, but he didn't love Claire either. And in that realization, the marriage ended long before the papers ever made it official. Julian didn't confess. He calculated. 3 days after Claire saw him with Madeline, he came home early, something he hadn't done in months. He placed his briefcase neatly by the door, loosened his tie, and poured himself a drink before she could ask a single question. The apartment felt staged, like a set prepared for a scene he had already rehearsed. "We need to talk," he said, sitting across from her, legs crossed, voice calm. Claire waited. She had learned that interrupting only gave him opportunities to redirect. "This isn't working anymore," Julian continued. "We've both changed. I don't think either of us is getting what we need." He spoke like a consultant delivering bad news with empathy built in. No blame, no apology, just inevitability. Claire studied his face. There was no guilt there, only relief. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," he added. "I think it's best we keep this efficient. No drama, no drawn-out nonsense." He slid a folder across the coffee table. The motion was practiced, smooth. Claire didn't open it yet. She didn't need to. She already knew what it would contain. Julian leaned back. "I'll make sure you're taken care of," he said, as if offering charity. "A small settlement, enough to get you on your feet." On your feet, as if she had been lying down. "You don't have savings?" he went on, not unkindly. "No stable income. And let's be realistic, starting over at this stage isn't easy. I don't want to see you struggle." There it was, the final insult wrapped in concern. Claire felt something inside her go very still. "You're saying this like a favor," she said quietly. Julian smiled. "It is. I could be much less generous." He didn't mention Madeline. He didn't need to. The absence was louder than any confession. He stood, signaling the conversation was over, already moving on. "Take a day to think about it," he said. "But don't drag it out. We both know how this ends." That night, Claire lay awake listening to the city hum outside their window. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. Instead, memories surfaced uninvited, moments she had dismissed, red flags she had explained away. The control, the erasure, the quiet certainty that she had been shrinking to make his life easier. By morning, her decision was clear. When Julian asked if she'd reviewed the papers, Claire met his eyes and nodded. "Yes," she said, "I'll sign." Julian exhaled, satisfied. He had no idea what that agreement truly was. Not a surrender, a door closing. The conference room smelled faintly of leather and expensive coffee, the kind meant to signal importance. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Manhattan skyline, sunlight cutting across the glass table where the divorce papers waited. Claire sat upright, hands folded, her coat still on. She looked like a visitor in her own life. Julian arrived 5 minutes late, unbothered. He greeted the lawyer with an easy smile, exchanged a joke, then took his seat without looking at Claire. When he finally did, it was with mild curiosity, as if checking whether she'd changed her mind overnight. "Ready?" he asked. The lawyer slid the documents toward Claire, pointing to the tabs. The words were dense, precise, merciless. Claire read every page. She noticed what was missing more than what was there. No acknowledgement of her contributions, no shared future obligations. Just a clean severing, drafted to protect Julian from inconvenience. "Any questions?" the lawyer asked. Claire shook her head. "No?" Julian raised an eyebrow, amused. "See? I told you she'd be reasonable." The pen felt heavier than it should have. Claire picked it up anyway. As she signed the first page, Julian leaned back, folding his arms. "You know," he said casually, "this is probably for the best. You were never comfortable in my world." Claire didn't respond. She signed again. Julian continued, emboldened by her silence. "You'll find something simpler, something more your speed." He smiled, the kind meant to sound encouraging. "Not everyone is built for ambition." The lawyer cleared his throat, uncomfortable. Julian ignored him. "Honestly," Julian added, glancing at his watch, "this is generous. Most people would have walked away with nothing." Claire finished the last signature and set the pen down carefully. She slid the papers forward. "I appreciate the efficiency," she said evenly. Julian laughed, short and satisfied. "That's the spirit." He signed his name with a flourish, then stood before the ink had dried. He extended a hand, not to her, but to the lawyer. The deal was done. Claire was no longer relevant. As Julian turned to leave, he paused, almost thoughtful. "One more thing," he said, looking at her. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I'd hate to see you struggle." Claire met his gaze for the first time since she'd entered the room. "I won't," she said. Julian smirked, misreading it completely. He nodded once and walked out, confident, unburdened, victorious. Claire remained seated for a moment after the door closed. Then she stood, straightened her coat, and left the room quietly. Julian believed he had just won his freedom. In truth, he had just signed away his future. By the time Claire stepped out of the office building, the city had already decided to keep moving without her. The air was sharp, the kind that stung her lungs and forced her to breathe slower. She stood on the sidewalk with a single bag over her shoulder, watching people hurry past in coats worth more than everything she owned. No one looked twice. In Manhattan, solitude was invisible. She checked her phone out of habit. No missed calls, no messages. The shared calendar Julian once managed had already disappeared from her screen, as if her life before noon had been quietly deleted. Claire walked. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't go back. The apartment was no longer hers, not even temporarily. Julian had been clear about that. Clean breaks were his specialty. She passed storefronts glowing with warm light, restaurants full of laughter, couples leaning toward each other, friends clinking glasses. Each window felt like a reminder of a life she had almost convinced herself was normal. Her feet began to ache, but she kept going. Movement felt safer than stopping. When she finally reached the East River, the city opened up into something colder and more honest. The water reflected the lights in broken patterns, beautiful and unreachable. Claire leaned against the railing, gripping it until the metal bit into her palms. This was the part she hadn't planned for. Not the divorce. Not the humiliation. But the silence afterward, when there was no role left to play, no marriage to manage, no expectations to meet. Just the raw question she had avoided for years. Who was she without permission? Her phone buzzed suddenly, startling her. An unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Ms. Montgomery," a man said, voice measured, professional. "My name is Thomas Hale. I'm calling regarding a legal matter that requires your immediate attention. Claire closed her eyes. Another complication, another form, another conversation where she would be told what she didn't have. I don't have a lawyer, she said. That won't be a problem, the man replied. We've been instructed to represent your interests. Her breath caught. By who? There was a pause, deliberate. By parties connected to your family. Claire laughed softly, the sound brittle. I don't have family. You do, he said, and you always have. The call ended before she could respond. Claire lowered the phone slowly. The river rushed on, indifferent, unstoppable. She felt exhausted, exposed, and completely unanchored. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. For the first time that day, the future felt uncertain in a way that wasn't small. And that terrified her, because it also felt like possibility. Claire barely slept that night. She lay on the unfamiliar bed of the borrowed apartment, staring at the ceiling as the city hummed through the walls. Every sound felt amplified, the distant sirens, the elevator cables, the muted laughter from another unit. Her mind replayed the phone call over and over, dissecting every word, every pause. We've been instructed to represent your interests. By morning, exhaustion had settled into her bones, but clarity came with it. Whatever this was, running from it wouldn't make it disappear. Claire dressed simply, choosing neutral colors, the way she always had when she didn't want to be noticed. She checked her reflection once, steadying herself, then left. The address texted to her led to a quiet building near Park Avenue. No sign outside, no reception desk. Inside, the space was minimalist glass, wood, deliberate emptiness. This was not a place that advertised power. It assumed it. A man in his late 60s stood as she entered. Tall, composed, gray hair combed back with precision. He didn't offer his hand right away. Ms. Montgomery, he said. Thank you for coming. You said your name was Thomas Hale, Claire replied. That doesn't explain why I'm here. He gestured for her to sit. Fair enough. Once she did, he slid a thin folder across the table. Unlike Julian's documents, these pages were few. No clutter, no excess. Before we go any further, Thomas said, I need to confirm something. Your mother's name was Eleanor Montgomery. Claire stiffened. Yes. And her maiden name was Whitlock. Claire's pulse quickened. Very few people knew that. Thomas nodded, as if checking off a box only he could see. Your mother was one of the original beneficiaries of a private trust established over 70 years ago. That trust still exists, and as of last month, you are the sole living heir with an active claim. Claire stared at him, stunned. That's impossible. It isn't, he said calmly. It's just inconvenient timing. She pushed the folder back. I didn't inherit anything. There was no will, no money. Thomas's expression softened, just slightly. Because your mother didn't want you raised inside it. She wanted you to choose your life without knowing what was waiting. And now, Claire asked. And now, he said, your marital status has changed. Certain protections no longer apply, which means the trust can no longer remain dormant. Claire's hands trembled despite her effort to stay composed. You're telling me this now because I got divorced? I'm telling you, Thomas said carefully, because for the first time, no one else can claim authority over you. The room felt suddenly smaller. Claire leaned back, overwhelmed. I don't want money, she said quietly. Thomas met her gaze. This isn't about money, he replied. It's about what was kept from you and why. And in that moment, Claire realized the divorce wasn't the end of her story. It was the trigger. Claire left the building with the folder pressed against her chest, like it might disappear if she loosened her grip. The city felt different now. Not kinder, not slower. Just sharper, as if every sound and reflection carried intent. She walked without direction, letting muscle memory guide her through familiar streets, while her mind replayed Thomas Hale's words again and again. A private trust. 70 years. Dormant by design. By the time she reached a quiet cafe, her hands were shaking. She ordered coffee she barely tasted and chose a corner table, her back to the wall. Old instincts. Survival habits she hadn't realized she still carried. She opened the folder. Inside were documents that didn't shout wealth. No dramatic numbers on the first page. No headlines. Just names, dates, legal language so precise it felt cold. Her mother's name appeared more than once, always followed by terms like beneficiary, restricted access, conditional heir. Claire swallowed hard. This wasn't a lottery win. It was a structure, a system. Something that had existed long before she did, and would exist long after if left untouched. One page caught her attention. A clause highlighted in pale yellow. Activation contingent upon marital dissolution or external coercion. Her breath hitched. They had been waiting for her to be free. Claire closed the folder and stared out the window, memories rearranging themselves without permission. Her mother's insistence on normalcy, the way questions about family were always redirected, the absence of photographs, of stories that reached too far back, and her father, the man who vanished after her mother's funeral, leaving behind nothing but a last name Claire learned to avoid saying out loud. Thomas Hale had said family. That word felt heavier than any number ever could. Her phone buzzed with a new message. "You don't need to decide anything today," it read. This was only the introduction. Claire exhaled slowly. Introduction was right. This wasn't a reveal designed to impress. It was incomplete by intention, a half-open door meant to test whether she would step forward or retreat. She realized then what unsettled her most. The trust hadn't saved her marriage. It hadn't stopped Julian from humiliating her. It hadn't softened a single night she'd spent feeling small. Whatever this inheritance was, it wasn't a rescue. It was a reckoning postponed. Claire gathered the folder, stood, and left the cafe. She didn't feel powerful. She felt exposed, as if someone had just turned on a light in a room she didn't know existed. But beneath the fear, a single thought took shape, steady and undeniable. Julian believed he had left her with nothing. He was wrong. She just hadn't been ready to know what she had. Thomas Hale asked Claire to meet him again 2 days later. This time, not in an office, but in a quiet private dining room overlooking Central Park. The shift in setting felt intentional, less legal, more personal. It made her uneasy. He was already seated when she arrived, hands folded, posture exact. A man used to being obeyed without raising his voice. "You didn't tell me everything," Claire said as she sat. Thomas nodded once. "I told you what you were ready to hear." She stiffened. "That's not your decision." "No," he agreed calmly, "but it has always been my responsibility." Claire studied him more closely now. The familiar shape of his jaw, the distance in his eyes she'd seen only in mirrors, never knowing where it came from. "You're my father," she said, not as a question. "Yes." The word landed without ceremony. No apology followed it. No explanation rushed in to soften the blow. Thomas waited, giving her space to feel the impact. "You left," Claire said quietly. "After my mother died, you disappeared." "I was removed," he corrected. "By design." Her hands curled into fists beneath the table. "You let me believe I was abandoned." Thomas didn't look away. "I let you believe you were free." The restraint in his voice cracked something open in her chest. Anger surged, sharp and overdue. "Free?" she echoed. "I spent my life making myself smaller because I thought that was all I was allowed to be." Thomas exhaled slowly. "That was the risk your mother accepted." He reached into his jacket and placed a single photograph on the table. Claire recognized it instantly. Her mother, younger, standing beside Thomas in front of a building she'd never seen, both of them serious, resolute. "She didn't want you raised as an asset," Thomas said. "She wanted you human first." Claire stared at the photo, then pushed it away. "And you agreed?" "I didn't," he admitted. "But I honored it." Silence settled between them, heavy and unresolved. "The trust is waking up," Thomas continued. "Not because you want it to. Because the world has started looking at you differently. Claire met his gaze. I don't want to be controlled again. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. Then you'll have to learn how power works, because, whether you claim it or not, others will try to. For the first time since the divorce, Claire felt truly afraid. Not of losing everything, but of becoming something she might not recognize. Claire tried to return to normal life, but normal no longer recognized her. The days after meeting Thomas blurred into a quiet tension she couldn't shake. She answered emails, she edited manuscripts, she walked familiar routes through the city. On the surface, nothing had changed. But underneath, every action felt observed, as if the air itself had learned her name. Thomas didn't call again. That, she realized, was deliberate. Instead, things began to move around her. A bank flagged an account she didn't remember opening. A courier delivered documents she hadn't requested, sealed, formal, addressed to her with a precision that made her uneasy. Even her landlord called to check in, his tone suddenly respectful, cautious, as if she had become someone worth accommodating. This was the first lesson Thomas hadn't needed to explain. Power didn't arrive loudly. It tightened quietly. Claire sat alone one evening, documents spread across the table, and finally understood the structure forming around her. The trust wasn't just money. It was leverage layered into systems legal, financial, political. It didn't ask permission. It assumed compliance. And every page came with conditions. Oversight committees, advisory boards, legal guardianships disguised as protection, clauses written to ensure stability, not consent. The more Claire read, the clearer it became. This inheritance came with a price. If she accepted full access, decisions would no longer be hers alone. Her movements, investments, even public relationships would be reviewed. The same language Julian had used, practical, efficient, for your own good, appeared again, only now dressed in far more elegant words. The realization hit her hard. She hadn't escaped control. She had changed its face. Claire closed the folder and pressed her palms flat against the table, grounding herself. Anger rose, but it wasn't wild. It was focused. This time, she recognized the pattern. This was how power justified itself. Later that night, Thomas finally called. You're seeing it now, he said, as if reading her thoughts. Yes, Claire replied, and I won't trade one cage for another. A pause. Measured. Assessing. You think freedom exists without cost? Thomas said. It doesn't. Neither does obedience, Claire answered. Silence stretched between them, heavier than before. You have time, he said at last. But not much. Others are watching. Claire ended the call without responding. She stood by the window, city lights reflecting in the glass, and made a decision that felt terrifying in its simplicity. If she was going to claim power, it would be on her terms. Not Julian's. Not her father's. Not the trust's. For the first time, Claire understood the real danger ahead. Not losing everything, but losing herself again. Julian Cross believed the timing couldn't have been better. 2 weeks after the divorce papers were finalized, his name began circulating in rooms that mattered. Not as a possibility, but as a certainty. Senior partner, board-facing, a man who had handled a difficult personal transition with professionalism. The narrative was clean, flattering, and carefully curated. At the office, people treated him differently. Assistants moved faster. Junior analysts laughed a little harder at his jokes. Even the managing director, usually distant, invited him for a private lunch overlooking the city. Manhattan stretched beneath them like proof of success. You're positioned well, the director said, swirling his drink. No distractions now. Julian smiled. He didn't correct him. The absence of Claire felt like relief. No more explanations. No more quiet resistance disguised as concern. He told himself he'd been patient for years, that he'd carried the weight alone. Now, finally, things could move forward. Madeline Price fit seamlessly into that forward motion. They didn't announce anything. They didn't need to. She began appearing at his side at the right moments after hour strategy meetings, networking events, informal drinks with compliance teams. She was sharp, composed, always asking the right questions. People noticed. Julian enjoyed the contrast. Madeline admired his ambition without questioning it. She listened without needing reassurance. When he talked about the future, IPO talks, internal restructuring, expansion, she nodded like someone who understood what it took to win. "You're wasted where you are," she told him one night, her tone calm, sincere. "They don't see how far you could go." Julian took that as truth, not encouragement. At home, his new apartment felt temporary but exciting. Clean lines, expensive furniture chosen quickly, without compromise. He slept well for the first time in months. The quiet no longer felt accusatory. It felt earned. Occasionally, Claire crossed his mind not with guilt, but with mild irritation. He wondered how she was managing. If she had found work. If she'd realized how generous he'd been. He never checked. From his perspective, the story was complete. He had shed a liability and stepped fully into his potential. The firm's upcoming compliance review didn't concern him. He had nothing to hide. Madeline assured him of that. "Everything looks solid," she said, glancing at her tablet. "Very solid." Julian believed her. He stood at the edge of his office one evening, watching the city lights come alive, convinced he was finally on the right side of momentum. He didn't know the ascent he was celebrating was being carefully measured, not to elevate him, but to determine how far he would fall. Madeline Price never rushed. That was the first thing Julian admired about her, and the last thing he would come to fear. While others scrambled for visibility, she moved with patience, filing reports quietly, asking questions that sounded harmless, and listening far more than she spoke. To Julian, it felt like loyalty. To everyone else, it looked like diligence. The compliance review began without drama. An email circulated. A calendar invite appeared. Standard procedure, Julian was told. Routine oversight ahead of the firm's expansion plans. He barely skimmed the details before forwarding them to Madeline with a casual note. "Let me know if anything's off." She replied within minutes. "All good. I'll handle it." And she did. Madeline spent long hours in closed conference rooms, her tablet always with her, her expression unreadable. She asked Julian for clarifications here and there, minor things, he assumed. Legacy accounts, old partnerships, transactions that predated his senior role. He answered easily. He had nothing to hide. What Julian didn't see was how she framed those answers. Context was everything. Madeline didn't fabricate evidence. She didn't need to. She reorganized it, highlighted patterns, placed dates side by side that had never been meant to be compared. She cross-referenced approvals with internal emails, flagged inconsistencies that had once been waved through as industry standard. It was elegant, meticulous, devastating. The first red flag surfaced quietly during a preliminary meeting. A compliance director frowned at a slide, then glanced at Julian. "This account here," she said. "Why was it routed this way?" Julian shrugged. "That structure's been in place for years." Madeline nodded, calm. "Before my time," she added, "but it does raise questions." Julian felt a flicker of irritation, not at the question, but at the way Madeline phrased it. Neutral, detached, as if she weren't standing on his side of the table. After the meeting, he pulled her aside. "You could have framed that differently." Madeline looked genuinely surprised. "Differently how?" "As settled," he said. "Not questionable." She tilted her head slightly. "Compliance doesn't work that way." Something in her tone unsettled him. Not defiant, not apologetic, just factual. Over the next week, the questions multiplied. Requests for documentation, follow-ups marked urgent. Julian reassured himself it was temporary, a procedural nuisance before the real rewards arrived. Madeline remained composed, professional, increasingly distant. One evening, Julian noticed she'd stopped staying late. Her desk was cleared by 6. Her calendar suddenly private. "Everything okay?" he asked. She smiled politely. "Of course." But the warmth was gone. And for the first time since the divorce, Julian felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Not guilt, unease, because the trap wasn't sprung with accusation or spectacle. It was closing around him silently, and he had helped build it himself. The boardroom filled slowly, deliberately. Julian arrived early, straightened his tie, and chose a seat near the head of the table. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline behind him, a reminder of how far he'd come and how close he was to the next step. He expected routine questions, a few technical clarifications, then approval. That was how these meetings always went. Madeline entered last. She didn't sit beside him. Instead, she took a seat across the table, placing her tablet down with care. The distance felt intentional. Julian told himself not to overthink it. The compliance director cleared her throat. "Thank you all for coming. We'll begin with a brief overview." The slides moved faster than Julian expected. Dates, accounts, flowcharts that looked more complex than necessary. He leaned forward as a graph appeared, lines intersecting in ways that made his stomach tighten. "This structure," the director said, pointing, "was designed to minimize exposure. However, when examined alongside internal correspondence, it suggests something else." Julian frowned. "Suggests what?" Madeline spoke before the director could answer. "Patterned concealment." The word landed hard. Julian turned to her. "That's not accurate." Madeline met his gaze calmly. "It's documented." A pause followed, heavy, uncomfortable. The director nodded. "We have reason to believe certain approvals were expedited without full disclosure." Julian felt heat rise in his chest. "Are you implying misconduct?" "I am stating concern," the director replied evenly, "which is why an external review has been initiated." Julian's pulse spiked. "By who?" The answer came from the far end of the table. "By us." A man Julian didn't recognize stood. Older, impeccably composed. He introduced himself with authority that didn't need explanation. "Legal counsel. Independent oversight." Julian's mind raced. This wasn't procedure. This was escalation. He looked to Madeline, searching for alignment, for reassurance. She didn't offer it. "I did my job," she said simply. Nothing more. The room felt suddenly hostile. Julian pushed back his chair. "This is absurd. You're turning standard practice into something else." The older man didn't react. "Standard practice depends on transparency, which appears lacking." Julian stood, jaw tight. One thought cut through the noise. Claire. This had her fingerprints all over it. The timing, the silence, the sudden scrutiny. He felt certain of it. As the meeting adjourned without resolution, Julian gathered his things with shaking hands. He didn't look back. He left convinced of one thing. Claire was finally trying to hurt him. He had no idea how wrong he was, and no idea how little control he still had. Claire thought she understood what betrayal felt like. She had lived through Julian's indifference, his quiet contempt, the way he replaced her without ceremony. She had survived that kind of loss by shrinking, by leaving before she was pushed. What she hadn't prepared for was the betrayal that arrived wearing her own last name. Thomas requested the meeting without explanation. A simple message, a time, a place, a private conference room overlooking the city she'd spent her adult life trying not to want too much from. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "The external review has accelerated," he said, folding his hands. "Julian's position is no longer stable." Claire stiffened. "I didn't ask for that." "I know," Thomas replied, "which is why this matters." He slid a document across the table. It wasn't financial. It wasn't legal in the way she expected. It was strategic. A proposal that outlined control structures, interim appointments, and a public narrative that positioned Claire as a neutral beneficiary stepping in to stabilize exposure. "You want me to be the face," Claire said quietly. "I want you protected," Thomas corrected. "Visibility creates insulation." Claire read the pages slowly. The language was familiar now. Efficient, reasonable, for your own good. "And after?" she asked. Thomas hesitated for the first time. After, the trust resumes normal governance, meaning without her. You said this was about choice, Claire said, looking up. This isn't choice. It's substitution. Julian out. You in? Thomas's expression hardened. Julian was reckless. You would be strategic. I would be controlled. Silence pressed in. The city below felt distant, unreal. You taught me something, Claire continued. That power tightens quietly. That it doesn't ask. It assumes. Thomas stood. You are not ready to manage what's coming. Claire rose to meet him. Then I won't manage it your way. For a moment, he looked at her not as a daughter, not as an asset, but as a variable he could no longer predict. You'll regret this, he said. Maybe, Claire replied, but it will be my regret. She left the room with her hands steady, her pulse loud, her future suddenly unguarded by anyone else's plan. Julian had betrayed her by underestimating her. Thomas betrayed her by believing he still owned the outcome. And for the first time, Claire understood the real cost of inheritance. It wasn't money. It was resistance. Claire didn't feel brave after walking away from Thomas. She felt exposed. For days, she lived in a careful quiet, half expecting consequences to arrive unannounced. She changed routes, kept her phone on silent, avoided the familiar places where decisions had once been made for her. This time, there was no structure to hide behind. No husband, no father, no trust acting as a buffer, only her. The temptation to retreat was constant. To accept Thomas's offer, step into the role designed for her, and let power decide what came next. It would have been easy, comfortable. She understood now why people surrendered to systems that promised protection. But every time she imagined it, something inside her recoiled. Claire spent an afternoon walking through Central Park, letting the city breathe around her. Children laughed. Runners passed without noticing her. Life continued without regard for legacies or leverage. It reminded her of something simple she had forgotten. Choice didn't announce itself. It waited. That night she called Thomas. I'm not stepping in, she said when he answered. Not now, not later. You're making yourself vulnerable, he replied. I already was, Claire said. I just didn't know it. He was silent, then colder. Without our backing, you'll be alone. Claire closed her eyes. I've been alone before. When she ended the call, she expected fear to rush in. Instead, there was a strange calm. Not certainty, not confidence, just relief. The next morning, she sent a single email to an independent legal firm recommended quietly, indirectly, by Thomas's own network. No demands, no declarations, just a request for consultation. If power was going to exist in her life, she would learn how to meet it standing. Across the city, Julian's situation unraveled faster than she expected. News traveled through private channels, not headlines. Meetings canceled, invitations rescinded. Madeline vanished from his orbit completely, her name no longer attached to his. Claire didn't celebrate. She didn't intervene. She watched. For the first time, the chaos wasn't hers to manage. Late one evening, as she sat alone with a cup of cooling tea, Claire understood the shape of what she'd chosen. Not revenge, not control, not inheritance as destiny, agency. She would build something slowly, quietly, without asking permission from men who believed ownership equaled authority. The trust could wait. The family could wait. Her life would not. Julian would fall without her push. Thomas would adjust without her obedience. And Claire, finally, would move forward not as someone's asset, but as her own. Julian's collapse didn't arrive with sirens or headlines. It came in quiet humiliations, one after another, stripping him of certainty before touching his pride. The first call was from his managing director. Short, formal, postponed indefinitely. No explanation offered. Julian stared at his phone long after the line went dead, convincing himself it was procedural, temporary. He told himself that a dozen times before noon. By afternoon, his calendar began to erase itself. Meetings vanished. Standing invites dissolved without comment. An email from compliance arrived, marked confidential, requesting additional documentation he no longer had access to retrieve. When Julian tried to reach Madeline, her number went straight to voicemail. He drove to the office anyway, clinging to routine like it might recognize him. The receptionist avoided eye contact. Security asked him to wait. Not rudely, carefully, as if he were already a problem. In a small conference room, a legal representative he'd never met explained the situation with clinical calm. External review, temporary leave, access restrictions pending investigation. Words stacked neatly, each one closing a door Julian had assumed was permanent. "This is excessive," Julian said, forcing a laugh. "You know my record." The man nodded. "Which is why this is being handled discreetly." Discreetly meant no defense, no negotiation, no timeline. By evening, Julian sat alone in his apartment, lights off, city glowing without him. He refreshed his phone obsessively. No messages, no reassurance. Madeline didn't respond. Colleagues stopped answering. The silence pressed harder than any accusation. He poured a drink and didn't taste it. Claire's name surfaced uninvited, sharp with resentment. He replayed the boardroom meeting, the timing, the way everything had turned without warning. He told himself she must have orchestrated it, that this was her delayed revenge. The thought comforted him, because if Claire had done this, then he still mattered enough to be a target. The truth arrived later, quieter and far more devastating. A mutual contact confirmed it casually. Madeline had transferred teams months ago. Her involvement in compliance was long-standing, independent, thorough. She hadn't chosen Julian. She had assessed him and found him lacking. The realization hollowed him out. Julian wasn't falling because of Claire. He wasn't being punished. He was being corrected by a system that had no memory of his ambition, no interest in his excuses, and no obligation to spare his ego. That night, Julian sat in the dark, finally understanding the cost of his certainty. He hadn't lost everything because he underestimated Claire. He lost everything because he believed he was untouchable. Claire learned about Julian's downfall the way she learned most things now, indirectly. A message from an old acquaintance, a careful sentence slipped into conversation. A pause where someone clearly expected a reaction. She gave none. Not because she didn't feel anything, but because what she felt no longer needed an audience. She was sitting in a small cafe near the park, laptop open, sunlight cutting across the table. The work in front of her was ordinary editing, notes, deadlines, but her hands were steady in a way they hadn't been for years. When the message came through, she read it once and set the phone face down. That was it. No surge of triumph, no urge to confront, no satisfaction sharp enough to taste, just a quiet acknowledgement. This was what consequence looked like when it wasn't fueled by rage. Julian had assumed, as many people did, that harm always required intent, that someone had to push. That punishment came with a face, a motive, a dramatic reveal. He had imagined Claire behind the scenes, finally asserting herself, finally trying to hurt him back. Claire hadn't done anything. She hadn't made calls. She hadn't filed complaints. She hadn't whispered to the right people or leveraged the right names. She had stepped aside and let systems do what systems were designed to do when unchecked ambition met scrutiny. That was the part Julian never understood. Power didn't need anger to function. It needed exposure. Claire closed her laptop and watched people pass outside. Dog walkers, parents, couples mid-argument, strangers moving through lives that didn't intersect with hers at all. The world hadn't shifted because Julian fell. It hadn't shifted because she rose. It had shifted because she stopped absorbing damage meant for someone else. Later that evening, Thomas called. She let it ring twice before answering. "It's done," he said. Not triumph, not regret, just fact. "Yes," Claire replied. "It is." "You could have intervened," Thomas added. "Redirected things." Claire leaned back in her chair. "So could you." Silence followed. Then a quieter admission. "You chose distance. "I chose myself," she said. When the call ended, Claire sat alone, feeling something settle that she hadn't expected. Peace. Not because Julian suffered, not because power shifted, but because for the first time, the outcome wasn't built on her silence or her sacrifice. It was built on her absence. And that, she realized, was enough. Claire didn't rebuild her life in dramatic gestures. She rebuilt it quietly, the way real healing happens, one ordinary choice at a time. She moved into a smaller apartment near the park, nothing extravagant, but entirely hers. Sunlight filled the kitchen in the mornings. She bought furniture slowly, choosing pieces that felt solid, dependable. For the first time, she noticed how much comfort came from ownership, not cost. Work returned to her naturally. Editing projects led to referrals. Referrals became consistency. She worked from her dining table, coffee cooling beside her laptop. Deadlines met without panic. There was dignity in earning without asking permission. And then there was Evan Brooks. They met without ceremony. A mutual introduction at a small industry panel, two people standing slightly apart from the crowd. Evan wasn't loud. He listened more than he spoke, asked thoughtful questions, didn't interrupt when Claire answered. He didn't seem impressed by titles or stories meant to signal importance. They talked again weeks later, then again. Walks through the park. Conversations that wandered without agenda. Evan never asked about her past in ways that felt invasive. He accepted what she offered, waited for what she didn't. Claire noticed the difference immediately. There was no pressure to perform, no subtle corrections, no quiet test disguised as concern. Evan respected her time, her work, her silences. When she disagreed with him, he didn't smile through it or redirect. He listened. One evening, sitting across from each other in a modest restaurant, Claire felt something unfamiliar settle into her chest. Safety. Not the kind promised by contracts or control, but the kind built through consistency. She told him about Julian eventually, not the details, just the shape of it. Evan didn't ask for more. He didn't turn it into a lesson. "That sounds heavy," he said simply. "I'm glad you're not there anymore." That was it. No analysis, no judgment, no need to be strong. The realization surprised her. She didn't need to be rescued. She didn't need to be admired. She needed to be met. Months passed. The trust remained unresolved by design. Thomas respected her distance, even if he didn't fully understand it. Claire's life filled with routines, laughter, plans that felt chosen rather than inherited. One night, as Evan reached for her hand while they watched the city lights blink on, Claire felt a quiet certainty. Love, she realized, didn't arrive with control or conditions. It arrived with space. And she finally had enough of it to let someone in. The wedding was small, by design. No ballroom, no press, no performance meant to signal status. Just a quiet estate outside the city, late afternoon light filtering through tall trees, the air warm and steady. Claire stood beneath an arch of simple white flowers, her hands calm, her breath even. She wasn't nervous. That was how she knew it was right. Evan waited for her with an ease that made her smile. He didn't look like a man bracing for a moment that would change his life. He looked like someone arriving exactly where he intended to be. When their eyes met, there was no surge of adrenaline, no dizzy rush, just recognition. Friends gathered close. A few colleagues, people who had known Claire not as a wife, not as an heir, but as herself. Thomas was not there. That was intentional too. Not out of punishment, but clarity. This chapter didn't need witnesses who remembered her as something else. When Claire spoke her vows, her voice didn't waver. She spoke of choice, of partnership without hierarchy, of love that didn't ask her to shrink or perform. Evan answered in kind, promising presence, not possession. There was laughter. There were tears. Real ones. Across the city, Julian Cross sat alone in a bar he couldn't afford to frequent anymore, nursing a drink he barely tasted. A muted television played above the counter, showing a lifestyle segment he wasn't watching. On his phone, a photo surfaced, shared quietly, casually. Claire in white. Claire smiling without effort. Claire beside a man who looked at her like she was enough. Julian stared at the screen longer than he meant to. For the first time, he understood the full shape of what he'd lost. Not money, not advantage, not leverage. He had lost access to the woman who once loved him without conditions, and there was no appeal process for that. Back under the trees, Claire and Evan shared their first dance, unchoreographed, imperfect, real. As the sun dipped lower, Claire felt something settle fully into place. This wasn't reward. It was alignment. She hadn't been compensated for suffering. She hadn't been handed a fairy tale to balance the scales. She had built a life that fit, one decision at a time. Love, agency, peace. Julian had signed away a marriage he never understood. Claire had claimed a future she finally did. And this time, nothing about it was borrowed. So that's how the story comes to a close. And if you're still here with us right now, really still here, then maybe something in this journey touched your heart in a quiet but honest way. Maybe you saw a piece of yourself in Claire's silence, in her endurance, or in the moment she finally chose herself. Life often teaches us that the deepest wounds are not caused by loud disasters, but by slow erosion, by staying too long where we are unseen. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Claire didn't heal by controlling others or seeking revenge. She healed by reclaiming her inner authority. Another Stoic reminder says, "The obstacle is the way." What tried to break her became the path that led her home to herself. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on where you may be giving away your power without realizing it. And remember, choosing peace is not weakness, it is wisdom. If this message spoke to you, please like the video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue telling stories that heal, one heart at a time.